guess I think that if we all came back in 200 years, we would find a landscape of fiction that was still centered on a very sort of basic core, and the basic core would look very much the same as it did in the 18th century, which is you have made-up, dramatic, largely realist stories that are organized into scenes. So this has been the sort of pattern of fiction since fiction kind of came into being. It doesn't really matter what medium these things exist in. They can be in film, they can be on television, they can be in video games, they can be in all kinds of media. But I think that's the core, and I'm not sure that I think that's going to change particularly. I think that for some reason that I don't fully understand is very, very stable. Even Harry Potter follows that basic pattern of made-up, dramatic, realist, scene-based.
I was just going to say, I had the opportunity to see Kindle once, which was plenty, and what I was struck by was that someone showed me my own book, and it was only like 2 paragraphs, and you had to go on to the next one, and there's a sense like you're running a race, that you've got to get to the next page, and there's something about a book in which you can actually go on mental leave. You can take time out. Because I saved a book that I read in the 60s, and it felt really good on my bookshelf. I left it there for 40 years. And then I went back to it recently, and it was so good I hated to finish it, so it took me reading it every night. It took me 4 months. And I would only read like a paragraph. And then I would go, and my mind would wander, and it would wander for quite some time. I said, how did he do that? And oh, is that fantastic? And so on. And I still don't remember the details, but I still remember how wonderful it was. And part of it was the process was daydreaming, I think. I don't know, it's in between daydreaming and actually concentrating. There's an intermediate thing where your mind wanders, and oh, he thought that, he did this, and then your mind, it's not really daydreaming where you're just thinking about nothing, but you're really thinking about yourself in relationship to the character. I think that's the thing which prompts us all to read, I suspect. And that really is yourself at an unconscious level engaged with the character at an unconscious level together. They're deciding what you like, and then they're telling you. And then you go back and read the next paragraph. You can't really do that with Kindle because you can't get a sense of, there's no map there. At least that's my opinion.
What book was that?
Doctors. What book was it? Do you remember?
Oh yeah, it's Stanley Elkin's. It's called A Bad Man. Stanley Elkin was an experimental novelist in the 60s. And I'll tout my favorite book. And it's basically a man who's owns a big store in Indianapolis, or one of the, I think it's Indianapolis actually. And he's arrested for doing something which technically was legal, but since he feels guilty, he figures he'll go to jail anyhow. And he goes as a bad man, in which they make him wear a clown suit and go to in a prison. And it's basically a Kafkaesque story, which is beautifully written, and it's about a man coming to his understanding of what it means to be a good man or a bad man. But I read it a long time ago, and I read it now, and it's still like, it's so wonderful, I'm going to read it again. Stanley Elkin is a great writer. He was an avant-garde writer of the 60s. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of him. Good.
Doctors, I want to know, do we use the same part of our brain when we're immersed in a novel as we do when we're reading a screen?
Well, see, that's why I told the story about the man with the stroke. I don't know where that information is stored. Because he had a story. Put it this way, memory isn't stored like jujubes in the brain. It's distributed massively through neural connections. So there's a little bit everywhere. And then if you cut out a little piece of brain, you don't cut out memory. By and large, the degree of memory deficit is related to how much memory is destroyed, with some exceptions. And because it's not stored in one spot. So I think that when you read a character, it's stored somewhere. Let's put it somewhere. And it may merge with other characters. So if you read 10 books that are somewhat similar, like if you read Camus, one of my favorites, you read his character, there's some overlap because they have certain moral issues, because most authors have one song they play in different ways. They will all blend together, but they will still be stored there. Maybe not separately as people, but as concepts, and so we don't know how an idea is stored. I mean, nobody has an idea how ideas are stored. Nobody has any ideas how the mind works, frankly. And you can idea that we understand anything about it. Would you agree with that, Blakey?
There's been a lot of hand waving, but yeah.
Can I just say that your story about your patient who said crew, it beautifully demonstrates sort of the associative way our minds works, and this is one of the gifts of fiction when we read it, is that it brings all these associations to mind, and on the level of you read one book and you have memories of other books, you have memories of other characters, you have memories of moments in your life, but it also, I mean, I know that as a reader, but I also know that when I'm writing, my mind works in a different, it really strains me in a wonderful and pleasurable way to think about, okay, so this is a little fact about math. Now, how is this associated with this character's journey in looking for her sister or whatever? So trying to figure those associations out strains my mind, but also the interesting thing about it is a lot of times it just happens, just like when you're reading. These associations will just sort of wash over you, and you were talking about Oliver Sacks, and isn't he the one who wrote the book about music in your brain? So I don't think that fiction can do it on the same level, but I think it is a similar phenomenon of the way that associations like move through your own private world, and that happens when you're reading a book of fiction or memoir, which works on the same principles as fiction, I think.
Before I go to, I just wanted to say one thing about the Oliver Sacks book, which will be out next week, which is really fascinating along the subject, is that he's spent an entire career describing patients. He's the observer, he watches the patients, and he's their friend, and he's their advocate. This most recent book is fascinating because the book is about the mind's eye, it's called, and it's about various people with visual disturbances, and we read about several. And then you read about Oliver Sacks having what he calls face blindness and how this may have directly affected his his social persona, so to speak. But you're not prepared for is that in the end of the book, Dr. Sacks gets an ocular melanoma, and he has to go through treatment for the eye with radiation and chemotherapy, and he basically loses the sight in the eye. But what's profound to me is that he's used his memoirs of 40 years to describe the course of his own life. Now, he's using other people's stories to, in fact, inform the way we see him. And it's really profoundly, it's spectacularly done. I don't even know if it was intentional, because you just come across it and you go, oh my goodness. And you realize that it's the arc of his career, but it's done in a way where you wouldn't notice it until he describes the eye thing. Anyhow.
I wish that Pat Conroy was with us tonight. He has a book coming out in a couple of weeks called My Reading Life. And he, again, so many great authors are people who were uncomfortable as children. But he talks about how his mother was entranced with Scarlett O'Hara, and Gone with the Wind was so important to her, and she formed so many ideas based on Gone with the Wind. And then a teacher who took him under his wing and got in huge trouble because of Catcher in the Rye. And how Conroy himself got fired as a teacher for having books that the school board didn't want. But one book after another, you've got to read this book when it comes out. You will love it, and you'll say, oh gosh, I love that book too, and it'll bring it all back to you.